Masechet Nazir Daf Lamed Bet. We begin with the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. Mi nadar ben Nazir v'nish'al lechacham v'asaro moneh misha'a shenadar. A person made the neder, and after a few days he said, you know what, I regret making this neder to be a Nazir, and he goes to a Chacham. After discussing it with the Chacham says, sorry, I don't find any way to undo it. You have to continue to be a Nazir. So he does not count from that day on that he had the discussion with the Chacham. Rather, he can count from the first day. So if he made a vow one day, and then 10 days later he talks to the Chacham, those 10 days he can count within the Nazirut, if he was a total of 30 days. So then he just has to have 20 more days after he speaks to the Chacham. Okay, that's a simple reading. It doesn't seem to be adding much of a chidush. Maybe we would have thought that since in his mind he's like, you know what, I'm going to go to the Chacham and undo it, that maybe those days wouldn't count. But really, this is here as a contrast to the next case where the Chacham does undo it. Now, the Gemara is going to assume that in this case we are talking about where, because he was going to go to a Chacham, he didn't take those first days seriously. For example, if it's 10 days, he's drinking wine during the 10 days. And then he goes to the Chacham and said, oh, you know, I never wanted to make it, and then you didn't even keep it. But turns out the Chacham says, no, you have to stay a Nazir. Nevertheless, you can count those days. Remember that only Tum'at Met breaks a Nazirut, and then you have to bring Korbanot and start all over again. The other things, like drinking wine, although it's prohibited, if one does drink wine, so you violate a sin and you get lashes, but the Nazirut continues. And so that would be the idea here. At least on a deoraita level, you can count those days, even though you were drinking wine, and even though you're expecting to go to a Chacham and figure that he's going to undo it, so you weren't so careful with it. Those days do count towards the total. Okay, the Gemara is going to add another layer of a d'Rabbanan fine on this person. All right, that's case one. Case 2. Nish'al lechacham v'hitiro, hayta lo behema mufreshet teseh v'tir'ai ba'eder. A person says, I'm going to be a Nazir, and while he's a Nazir, he separates animals for his concluding korbanot. But then, at some point, he goes to a Chacham and says, I regret being a Nazir, and the Chacham annuls his Nazirut. So now it turns out that this animal that he had made consecrated is no longer needed, and in fact is no longer consecrated because retroactively he never was a Nazir. So if a random person just says, here's an animal for my Nazirut, but you're not a Nazir, you don't make it Hamikdash, and therefore it can go and graze with the rest of the flock because it's chulin. Even though for a certain time period it was consecrated, but retroactively he was not a Nazir, so it was not consecrated, so he can go on. Now, this opinion is not stated in anybody's name, so it sounds like everybody would agree with this. But Amru Bet Hillel leBet Shammai, Yatem modim bazeh shu hekdesh ta'ut v'sheteseh v'tirei ba'eder. So Bet Hillel tells Bet Shammai, you agree with this law, right? This is a unanimous law that these animals can go back and become chulin. But I know Bet Shammai, don't you say that in a general, hekdesh ta'ut is hekdesh? We saw that in the previous Mishnah. Someone says, an animal that comes out of my house, black. The black one that comes out of my house first is going to be hekdesh, and the white one comes out. Bet Shammai, according to the Peshat of the Mishnah, said, yes, even though he made a mistake, nevertheless, it is hekdesh. So don't you agree with that? And in this case, you should say that even though he made the thing consecrated because he thought he was a Nazir, and it turns out he was in error because he undid it, nevertheless, you should say that it becomes Hekdesh anyway, because even though it's erroneous, it should still be Hekdesh. So how can you explain this, that it goes and can continue to be in the field like it's Holin? So Bet Hillel is challenging Bet Shammai from this Mishnah. Now, Bet Shammai doesn't answer this question here. He responds by bringing a different source that is against Bet Hillel's position. So how would they answer the question? Well, we're going to see in the Gemara, they could actually say simply, this is not a case of an erroneous, actually this person is never a Nazir in the first place. So it doesn't apply. The Nizirut never applied, and so his consecration never applied either. It's different from an error where I said the black one that comes out first. So even though I thought a black one would come out first, but it turns out to be a white one, so something came out, and therefore we say even though there was an error in his language, but coming out first still applies. So then in that case, that's when Bet Shammai says an erroneous consecration is still valid. But here, it's not erroneous. There never was a consecration. There never was a Nazir. Okay, so Bet Hillel can answer that question directly. But he wants to go further and challenge Bet Hillel's position. Bet Hillel said erroneous consecration is not valid. Hey, so Bet Shammai says, what about this case? אמר להם בית שמאי, אי אתם מודים במי שטעה וקרא לתשיעי עשירי ולעשירי תשיעי ול11 עשירי שהוא מקודש. So Bet Shammai says, in a case of animals where there's a law, you have to, every 10th animal, ma'aser behema, a farmer, a shepherd has to give a tenth of all the animals that are born within a certain season. They are hikdash. Now, how does he do that? Well, at the end of the season, he gathers all the animals in a pen, and he makes a small opening that only one can go through. And then he'll count as they go through. 1, 2, 3, right? 7, 8, 9, 10. And the 10th one, he takes a staff and marks it. So then they get all mixed up. So every 10th one that passed through has a mark, and then he can go and find all the ones that have that marking, and all those will be consecrated. Okay, so that's a normal system, and most shepherds, they can count to 10, and that's fine. But what if a shepherd makes a mistake, and he goes 7, 8, and he skips 9 by mistake? I don't know, maybe he's just looking at the next one, and instead he goes from 8 straight to 10. Then he realizes his mistake, and so he goes back to 9, and then continues in order 10. So basically he said 7, 8, 10, 9, 10. Right, so he called the 9th one 10, and the 10th one he called 9, and the 11th one he called 10. Right, so he said 10, 9, 10. So what's the law? The law is, halacha, is that all three of those are hikdash. The one that he called 10, that was actually the 9th. The one that he called 9, that was actually the 10th. And the 11th one that he called 10. So either if you call it 10, or it is actually the 10th, even if you call it the 9th, all three of those become hikdash. So you see that Bet Shammai proves from this law that a consecration in error is still a consecration. And Bet Hillel, don't you agree with that law? So you should agree with me that hikdash ta'ut is hikdash. That's Bet Shammai's counter argument. But Bet Hillel defends himself. Amru lahem Bet Hillel, lo hashevet kiddesha. Says, hold on, how does this work? The staff itself, that the staff doesn't make something hekdesh. Uma ilu ta'a v'hiniach et hashevet al shemini v'al shenem asar, shema asa kelum. For example, if as they're going through, he makes a mistake, not 1 away from 10, but 2 away, 2 or more away, and on the 8th one that comes out, he puts the staff on it and gives it a mark. And he says, oh, this is 10. He just counts wrong. Or on the 12th one, will that work? Will it be consecrated? The law is it is not. Right? This law of making an error only applies if it's 1 away, but not if it's 2 or more away. So you see that it's not because of an error. If you say that any error is valid, makes it hekdesh anyway, so it shouldn't matter where he makes the error. He said, oh, this is 10, right? Even if he did it in any random place, it would be hekdesh. But that's not the halacha. The halacha only applies if it's 1 away from the 10th, but not 2 away. So the proper explanation is Ela katuv shekidesh asiri hu kidesh atishii. The same pasuk that says it's the 10th, that's what teaches us that it would be the 9th, vet achadasar, or the 11th. It's a gezerat hakatuv. It's just an edict. It's not because of all cases error. It's just particular error. It's a kind of error that happens often, and so We have to be stringent about this. If it's one away, it's kind of close enough, and so we're going to count that as consecrated. But not all errors. This is a special case. This is an exceptional case, according to Bet Hillel, and therefore cannot be used as a proof for the general law that about errors in consecration. Okay, so you see Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel each bring one proof, and each one says about the other's proof that that's exceptional, right? Bet Hillel says this thing about the every 10th animal and being one, that's an exceptional case. In general, Hekdesh Ta'ut is not valid, whereas Bet Hillel says in general it is valid. This case here that you're bringing of the Nazir who retroactively was not a Nazir, that's an exception because it's not really an error. He was never a Nazir to begin with. Okay, good. So that's the machloket in the Mishnah, which we will analyze in a minute. But first, regarding the opening law, we ask, Mane matnitin, lo Rabbi ve'lo Rabbanan. It seems like neither of the following two opinions can be the author of our Mishnah. Right, remember, we're talking about a case where someone declares himself to be a Nazir, then drinks wine for some of the days, and then tries to undo it, but is unable to undo it. The Chacham will not let him out. And the question is, how many more days? According to the Mishnah, the simple reading of the Mishnah seems that he does not have to add any more days. Right? The Mishnah said, Moneh misha'a shenadar. He can start counting from the day he made the vow, and all those days in between that he drank wine, we don't count. They can count. It doesn't matter that he was drinking wine. It was prohibited, but those days still count, and he doesn't have to add any more days. Right? If he said, I'm going to be a Nazir for 100 days, and on some of the days in the middle he was drinking, so he counts from the beginning, and that's it, 100 days altogether. You do not have to add any. That's what it sounds like from the Mishnah. However, the following two opinions, and this seems to be like all the opinions, Rabbi Yosef or the Banan, who else could it be? They say that you do have to add a certain number of days in this type of case. The Tanya, here's a Braita. It's also paralleled in the Tosefta. Mi shenadar ve'avad al neziruto en nizkakin lo ela imken moneh bahen isur kayamim shenahag bahem heter. Someone made a vow and then he violated his vow by drinking wine, for example, not tumat met. That tumat met is a different story. Then he would undo everything. He has to redo all of his days. But if he only drank wine, so, and this kakin law, we do not deal with him, right? We're not going to let him off the hook until he counts the number of days like of Isur as he did with Heter. In other words, any days that he was drinking wine, you have to count them, and you have to add them on at the end as a penalty. Midoraita, let's say a person has said, I'm going to be for 100 days. And then for 60 of the days, he drank wine. For 40 of the days, he was on good behavior. Now he comes at the end, he says, I want to complete my Nazirut, I want to bring my sacrifices. So we say, what's the story? You did good the whole time? He says, no, I drank wine for 60 of the days. We say, sorry. In the Bet Hamikdash, we say, sorry, we're not letting you off the hook just yet, right? You made light of your Nazirut. Well, the rabbis don't like that, and therefore, as a penalty, you're going to have to do 60 more days, right? All of those days you drank wine, now you're going to have to do them properly, so that all together, you'll have 100 proper days. That's the opinion of Rabbanan. Rabbi Yosef Omer, Dayo Sheloshim Yom. Rabbi Yosef says, no, 30 days is enough. Now, there's more than one way to interpret this 30 days is enough. One interpretation is that even if he drank wine for 60 days, the penalty doesn't have to be that he has to redo all 60 days. 30 days is enough because that's the minimum amount of a Nazirut, even though he said 100 days. Okay, he did 100 days, even though not all of them were good. As long as he has 30 good days, that's sufficient. And that in this example, well, he had 100 altogether, 60 bad, 40 good. So we had 40 good days. So then you wouldn't have to add anything. If it was a shorter amount, if he was, let's say, only 30 days and he drank wine for 10 of them, so then he'll have to add 10 more. If he drank wine for all 100 days and it was a 100-day thing, he'll have to add 30. That's one interpretation of the Rabbi Yosef. But I'm going to follow a different interpretation here of Rabbeinu Peretz, which says that he only has to add more days if he drank wine for 30 days or more. In other words, we give him some leeway, right? You messed up on a couple of days. It's prohibited, of course, right? But we're not going to give you a penalty if you drank wine from between 0 and 29 days. No penalty. But if you drank wine for more than 30 days, so then you really messed up your this Nazirut. Then you get a penalty, and you have to add extra days. Okay, so let's follow that interpretation of Rabbi Yosef because it fits better with the language in the continuation. The main question from this Baraita is going to be the fact that according to both Rabbi Yosef and Rabbanan, you have to add more days in certain circumstances. Whereas in the Mishnah, it just said you count from the beginning of his vow. And it doesn't say anything about adding more days. So these two sources seem to be in contradiction, according to both opinions. The answer is going to be that we might be talking about different cases. And both Rabbanan and Rabbi Yosef would agree that there are some cases in which Rabbi Yosef at least would agree that there are some cases you don't have to add days. And Rabbanan, we're going to have to reinterpret his words a little bit. Okay, so here's the question. Ira banan kashya nezirut mo'etet, ira be'oseh kashya nezirut merubeh. If you're going to follow Rabbanan, so Rabbanan would have a problem if the truth is he would have a problem no matter what, because whether it's a 30-day or a 100-day, no matter how long, if you drank wine for one day, you're going to have to add another day at the end. But for Rabbanan, it would be a problem even if it was a short period of only 30 days and he drank wine some of the days, you're going to have to add some more days. So it's a problem for Rabbanan. And for the Bioseh, it would be a problem especially if it's a long period, let's say 100 days. Because if it's 100 days, then there's a bigger chance that he drank wine for 30 of those days. You see, if it's only a 30-day period, for the Bioseh, as long as he didn't drink wine for 1 or 2 days, he's okay with no penalty. So then a 30-day Nazirut altogether, the Bioseh would be in agreement with the Mishnah. But if it's many days, and thereby, because of that, it's more likely he drank wine for over 30 days, then there would be a penalty. And so, you see, either way, it doesn't match with the Mishnah. And so our answer is, I ba'et tema Rabbi Yosef, vi ba'et tema Rabbanan. Usually the phrase is, I ba'et ema, if you want, I will say. Over here it's, if you want, you can say. Okay, it's equivalent phrases, but it's interesting that it's a little bit different here. Okay, if you want, you can explain it according to the Bioseh, and if you want, you can explain it according to Rabbanan. So we went from 0 people being the possible authors of the Mishnah to saying, really, we can explain it according to everyone. How so? Iba'et tema Rabbi Yosef, kan benezirut meruba, kan benezirut mo'etet. It could be according to Rabbi Yosef. And Rabbi Yosef in the Baraita here, that's talking about when he Nazir for a long time, let's say 100 days, or maybe more. And within that, it's likely he will, if he wasn't careful, that he would have drunken wine for more than 30 days, and then he's going to be slapped with a fine. But the Mishnah is talking about where it's a short Nazirut, only 30 days. So as long as he was careful for 1 or 2 days not to drink wine, there's going to be no fine. That's why the Mishnah said no fine. And Rabbi Yosef is simply elaborating in the Baraita and saying, oh, well, if it's a long one, then there could be a fine. Or, Iba'et tema Rabbanan, la tema misha'a she nazar, ela ema ke misha'a she nazar. Or I could explain it according to Rabbanan, and don't read it literally as from the time that in the Mishnah. Don't read it literally as that he can count from the day that he made the vow, because really he's going to have to add some more days. Rather say, like from the day that he made the vow. So if on the day that he made the vow, he said 100 days, and then he has to count 100 days, and hopefully he'll go through without any incident. But if he does drink, so he drank for 60 days, and now he says, okay, I made teshuvah, I'm not going to drink anymore. So good, he did 40 days. Well, now you have to add 60 more in accordance with the number of days that he vowed at the beginning. So it doesn't mean literally from the beginning, but rather like from the beginning, the same number of days. And now we work if it's short also. If it's 30 days and he drank wine for here and there in the middle for 10 days. So you have to start from the beginning. You can count from the beginning means you can count the number of good days that were around from the beginning, but it has to add up to a total of 30, right? Just like at the beginning, he would have he needed at that point 30 full days for 30 days that were kosher. So too, at this point, at the end, we see, well, you had 20 good days, fine, now you need 10 more. It will have to add up to the full number of days, just like at the beginning. Okay, one more note about terminology. You see in the printed edition, it does say iba'et tema everywhere here. If we check the manuscripts, we'll see that actually this is only in the printed editions. In the manuscripts, it says iba'et ema. Here, iba'et ema in all three manuscripts. Iba'et ema in all three manuscripts. So the manuscripts have the more usual phrase, if you want, I will say. For some reason in the printed edition here, it says iba'et tema. But you can't really chalk this up as an exception to the general terminology. The general terminology throughout Shas and in this sugya also in the manuscripts is iba'et ema. All right, and that brings us to the next section. Nish'al chachamim v'hitiruhu. So the next part says, if a person was a Nazir, he designated an animal sacrifice, and he went to a chacham and he said, "Okay, you're not a Nazir anymore. That sacrifice that he consecrated is no longer consecrated," and everybody agreed to that law. Now, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, midebet Shammai nishma ledebet Hillel. Listen, we can, and from what Bet Shammai responded to Bet Hillel's challenge, we can learn something about what Bet Hillel thinks in a case where is not said, right? So we're going to triangulate or bring parallels between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. So we know what Bet Shammai says in a certain case. We're going to learn from that what Bet Hillel would say in a parallel case. Okay, as follows. Lav amre bet Shammai hekdesh betaut have hekdesh, kevan diglae milta de lav shapir nezar tesevetir ba'eder. Didn't Bet Shammai say that an erroneous hekdesh is valid? It is hekdesh anyway. That is his general rule, and that's what we saw regarding the black animal. Turns out to be a white animal that came out. It is hekdesh. However, in this case, Bet Shammai agrees with Bet Hillel, with the Nazir, because since it is revealed retroactively that this guy was not a Nazir, right? And Delav Shapir Nazar, his vow was not a valid vow because he annulled it. And so therefore, since it turns out he was never a Nazir, so, this animal, it can go. No, this is not a case of error. It's a case of retroactive undesignation. He was never a Nazir. That's why Bet Shammai agrees in this case. All right, so now we know that Bet Shammai is going to distinguish between an error, which is valid, versus something that is simply retroactively undone, in which it is not a consecration. Now, we can learn from there about Bet Hillel regarding Temura. Remember yesterday, we saw that Bet Shammai says, how do I know that the beginning error in the making something consecrated works? Because in Temura, that also works. Even though if it's an error, if I by mistake replace one thing with another, even if I make a mistake in my language, it still is a Temura. So too at the beginning. And Bet Hillel says, no, I don't think you should compare Temura at the end, where animal A is already consecrated, and I want to apply it to animal B. That's not the same as the beginning, where it's not consecrated yet. Okay, so we already made that parallel between consecration and error and Temura. And Bet Hillel thinks that an error in Temura does make it consecrated. He just doesn't apply it to an initial consecration. So now we can learn something for Bet Hillel. LeBet Hillel name. Af al gav de'amre temura betaut havya temura. Bet Hillel agrees. Everyone says that a temura that's done in error is a temura. Yes, that's true. That's only if A, the original animal, remains a consecrated animal, and I made some kind of mistake, well then A and B nevertheless become hekdesh. But if I undo animal A, I go to a chacham and I say, I want to annul that consecration of animal A, and in the meantime, I had already tried to replace it with animal B, and so both of them were consecrated. Once I annul A, and A is no longer consecrated, so too animal B is also annulled. Just like Bet Shammai says regarding initial consecration, that a retroactive annulment undoes the consecration. So Bet Hillel would apply the same logic regarding Temura. So let's give an example of this. A person has animal A, and he made it consecrated. Okay, very good. And then he said, listen, that animal over there in the barn, the black one, is going to be a replacement for this one here. Now, it turns out to be an error. The animal that he was thinking of was white. So everyone would agree that other animal, the black one, the one that was white that he thought was black, called animal B, is consecrated. That's the way it works. That's the way Timurah works. And even though it was an error, he made an error, nevertheless, it's still consecrated. However, if the person goes to the Chacham and says, listen, animal A, I wanna annul my consecration, and so he goes and annuls it. And now, since A was annulled, B, let's say regular case of B, doesn't matter. It was right here, A, B, right here, no case of error. And so once A is annulled, so now retroactively A was never consecrated. That means when he tried to make the replacement and says, I want B to be Kodesh instead of A, well, it turns out A was never Hekdesh. So the holiness of A can't transfer to B, and once A gets undone, B also gets undone. So even though that Bet Hillel does not agree with Bet Shammai regarding consecration error at the beginning anyway, right? So according to Bet Hillel, the beginning consecration in none of these cases is consecrated, but he would agree with this distinction that in a case where consecration and error is a consecration, meaning Timurah, but a retroactive undesignation would be a non-designation at all, just like Bet Shammai says in this case. Okay, good. So that's a very interesting kind of triangulation of a case that we don't know at all, based on machloket, and what Bet Shammai does say about a parallel case we can learn from Bet Hillel. It's kind of like a geometric proof. Good. Amar Mor. Now, quoting the Mishnah, Iatem modim shilu kara l'tishii asiri. So this is when Bet Shammai responds to Bet Hillel and says, oh, don't you agree that a consecration in error is a consecration? After all, if you make a mistake and you count 8, 10, 9, 10, all three of those middle ones are consecrations. Now, Itmar, Maaser, Rav Nachman amar ta'ut velo kavanato, Rav Chisda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna amre ta'uto, v'kol sheken kavanato. So there's machloket here about that case of consecration of the Maaser animals. Rav Nachman says, ta'uto, that only when he makes a mistake, an error, he counted number 9 as 10, and he just made it, he was counting wrong, he was thinking of something else. That's when that one, the 9th one, becomes consecrated, and the 10th and the 11th, all of them, because he made a mistake. But if he did it on purpose, he said, listen, I know this is, he's thinking in his mind, I know this is the 9th, but you know what? I'm going to mark it with my staff anyway. I'm going to say, this is Maaser. If you do it on purpose, it doesn't work, right? Because there's a system here. It only goes to every 10th one. That's Rav Nachman. Rav Chisda, on the other hand, says, wait, if when I do it in error, it's consecrated, all the more so when I have an intention, right? I have intention, so now I'm giving more to Maaser. Well, it certainly is going to work if when I do it by mistake, it's Hekdesh. Certainly if I do it on purpose, even though I know it's the 9th, I make it the 10th, all the more so. Okay, we can understand the logic either way. This Kal Vachomer makes sense. Rav Nachman also makes sense. If I know that it's the 9th, then really in the back of my mind, I know it's not the 10th. So I can't make something ma'aseh that isn't the 10th. Whereas if it's by mistake, so I don't actually know that I'm making a mistake, I actually think it's the 10th, because I think it's the 10th, so it's an erroneous consecration, but that could be a consecration because at least I do think it's the 10th. Okay, that's the machloket. And now we're gonna challenge Rav Nachman's opinion. Amar le Rav Nachman, ledidacht amar ta'uto velo kavanato, da kamri bet Shammai le bet Hillel, I atem modim she'ilu kara la tishii asiri, vela asiri tishii, ul'achad asar asiri, sheloshta mekudashin, ve'ishtiku bet Hillel. My question to you, Rav Nachman, is according to your interpretation, how come Bet Hillel doesn't answer Bet Shammai and give that and tell them, wait, these cases are different? Let's elaborate. He says, according to you, Rav Nachman, because you say, in the case of the Ma'asar Behema, only if he designates it in error, that's when the erroneous designation is a designation. All right, and then according to you, when Bet Shammai tells Bet Hillel, don't you agree that if he called the 9th one 10, and the 10th one he called 9, and the 11th one he called 10, all three are Kodesh, and Bet Hillel was quiet, like he had no answer to it? No, Bet Hillel should have answered, wait, you can't compare Ma'aser to a case of Hekdesh. Because other cases of Hekdesh, when you're just taking a regular animal and saying, I want this to be a korban, because regarding Maaser, if I do it on purpose, if I try to make the 9th one purposefully Maaser, it doesn't work. So this is a completely different category than regular animals that I want to bring as a sacrifice, as a whatever, as an olah, as a hatat, where I have to do it on purpose, right? That's the main way you do it, is on purpose. So you can't bring me a comparison from something where purposeful it's purposeful, but I got the wrong one. So I can't say a purposeful mistake, right? But a purposeful consecration of the wrong animal does not take effect. That's a completely different category from regular Hekdesh, where it has to be done with proper intent. So that's what Bet Hillel should have said. Hey, you're bringing me a different category. But to defend Rav Nachman, I'll tell you why Bet Hillel didn't answer that. Because the Kal Vachomer hu ma'aseh she'eno kadosh bekavana, kadosh betaut, hekdesh kadosh bekavana, lo kol sheken. Because Bet Hillel knew that he's going to have a Kal Vachomer against him. According to Rav Nachman, the Kal Vachomer is as follows. You see that Ma'asar Behema does not become consecrated when done intentionally, when he intentionally picks the 9th one. And nevertheless, when I do it by mistake, it becomes consecrated. So you see that Ma'asar Behema becomes consecrated even when it's erroneous. So Hekdesh, which does become consecrated when done on purpose, all the more so, it should get consecrated when done by mistake. In other words, Ma'asar Behema has a restriction, right? It's harder to consecrate Ma'asar Behema because the consecration only works in one category, when done erroneously, and not when done purposefully. So therefore, regular Hekdesh, which for sure does work purposefully, all the more so it will work when done by mistake. And so Bet Hillel knew that he would have this Kal Vachomer against him, and that's why he didn't respond. But in the end, the Gemara says, you know what? The question against Rav Nachman is a good question, and really Bet Hillel could have responded something, because velohi dehekdesh beda'ata demaretale. The reason you can't make this Kal Vachomer because they're a different category. Hekdesh depends on the knowledge of the owner. The owner has to have intention, because he's taking a regular animal. He doesn't have an obligation to take any of these animals and make them Hekdesh. any particular one. So he says, I decide I want to bring an olah. Okay, this one's going to be an olah. So it has to be with his intention, because he's the one making it through his knowledge and statement. He's making it hekdesh. That's different from masar behema. Masar behema is a Torah obligation that says 1/10 of all these are going to be consecrated. All you're doing is counting them out to just designate which one is going to be. But the consecration happens from the Torah law, right, almost by itself. And so you're just kind of corralling, okay, which ones will be this way, which ones will be that way. So someone has to decide, so we need some system to decide which 10th will be the 10th that is consecrated. So that's why it makes sense to actually separate them and say, no, you can't make a kal vachomer. There's a good reason why. For Hekdesh, you need the knowledge of the owner, whereas for Ma'asar Behema, it's just the system itself, and anything that he touches with through that system will be hekdesh erroneously, even erroneously. And so really, the two are not comparable. All right, and that brings us to the next Mishnah. מי שנדר בנזיר והלך להביא את בהמתו ומצאה שנגנבה. אם עד שלא נגנבה בהמתו נזר, הרי זה נזיר. ואם מי שנגנבה בהמתו נזר, אינו נזיר. Okay, a person declares himself to be a Nazir. He doesn't say anything else, no conditions or anything. But in the back of his mind, he knows back on his farm, he has an animal, and he's going to want to use that for his one of his concluding sacrifices, and is relying on the existence of that animal that he can use that. He's not going to have to go spend more money out of his pocket. Now, after some days, he goes and checks on that animal and finds out that it was stolen. Well, what is the status of Nazirut? He didn't say a condition, but it's kind of like it was conditional based on the existence of that animal. So it depends on when it was stolen. He has to go find out, check the cameras and see the exact date and time. If it was stolen before Nazar, then he's a Nazir. If he became a Nazir first, he took the vow first, and after that it was stolen, well then, at the time that he made the vow, the animal was there. So it's a valid vow. There's a change in the circumstances afterwards. Well, that's your problem. I mean, if he wants, he can go to a Chacham and say, listen, I can't afford it, whatever, and see what the Chacham says. But the vow is a valid vow because the animal was there at the time. However, if if he made the vow after it was already stolen, right? He didn't realize, but it was already stolen. So then, at the time that he made the vow, thinking in his mind, I know I'm going to use that animal for my Nazirut. So since the animal wasn't there and he was depending on that animal, like a condition, so his vow never applied in the first place. All right, so this is an important distinction, and we're going to now see another application of it, a fascinating one, regarding the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. V'zot ta'ut טעה נחום המדי, כשעלו נזירים מן הגולה ועשו בית המקדש חרב, אמר להם נחום המדי, אילו הייתם יודעים שבית המקדש חרב, הייתם נוזרים? Amru lo v'tira Nachum Hamadi. Nachum Hamadi, one of the sages from the time right before and through the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash in 70 CE, he did not make this distinction that we just said. And we're going to see that the sages told him that was an error. Now, so what happened? There was some Nazirim. They lived outside the land of Israel. He himself, Nachum, says he was the Mede. He probably was born out in Persia somewhere. And then he moved to Israel. So these Nazirim, they didn't get the news, right? The news did not travel very fast back then. And so they made themselves Nazirim, assuming that the Bet HaMikdash was still up and they would bring their korbanot. Now, they must have known that they're in the middle of a war, a revolt against the Romans, but most people probably figured that the revolt either will beat the Romans, or even if we lose, the Romans may, kill a lot of people, but why would they destroy the Bet HaMikdash? In fact, we know that Titus was deliberating, should he destroy it or not? The contemporary sources say that. Okay, so it was not definitely clear to everyone that it was going to be destroyed. So they thought that it was still up, and now they're coming after after they finished their days. Right, they have all their long hair and everything, and they're bringing their korbanot. And now they get to Jerusalem. They're surprised, very sadly surprised, that the Bet HaMikdash has been destroyed. And now, not only is this sad for the nation, but also they have no way to undo their Nazirut. Right, this is a problem. If someone become a Nazir today, even if it's just for 30 days, they wouldn't have a way to conclude because you can't bring the korban. So the Nahum Hamadi said, listen, I have a way out for you, right? If you had known that the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, would you have made yourself a Nazir? They said, no, we wouldn't. And Nahum Hamadi said, oh, that's okay. Then you're okay. And you're not Nazirim. In fact, you were never Nazirim in the first place, right? Because you assumed when you made it that you would have been Nazirim. Okay, from here it looks like he did a hatara, that they were Nazirim, and he undid it. And there's two ways to interpret this first case also, right? If the animal was never there, was already stolen, so then you have to do hatara, or is it automatically never a Nazir? So however you explain this, you'll explain this story. Let's explain them both to say that since the condition that he had in mind wasn't there at the time he made Nazirut, he was never a Nazir to begin with. Okay, now, וכשבא הדבר אצל חכמים אמרו, כל שנזר עד שלא חרב בית המקדש נזיר, ומי שחרב בית המקדש אינו נזיר. And then the matter came before the sages, and they said, wait a second, it depends. If he became a Nazir before the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, then they as a Nazir. At the time they said they're going to be a Nazir, Bet HaMikdash was there. So it's not an error. Whereas if the Bet HaMikdash had already been destroyed, they just didn't know, and they said I'm a Nazir, then their Nazirut vow was an error to begin with, and therefore they were never a Nazir. Okay, so this is so the sages then, you see, disagreed with Nahum Hamadi. And that's why it says here that this is a mistake that Nahum Hamadi made. He didn't recognize this distinction of you have to look at when something happens. All right, fascinating Mishnah, and the Gemara comments. Amar Rabba shetafuhu Rabbanan Rabbi Eliezer ve'ukmeh b'shitatayhu ditnan potchin benolad divrei Rabbi Eliezer v'chachamim osrim. Okay, now we're referring to a Mishnah that's going to come later on page 64. It's a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim. That relates to our subject. It has to do with nolad. Nolad means a new situation that comes about that one would be hard-pressed to have foreseen. There's less than 5% chance, I'm making up a number, that this would have happened. It's so unforeseen. So the question is, can you use that to annul a vow? So Rabbi Eliezer says you can, right? If something completely, UFO comes down, right? And if you knew that there was a UFO would come down, would you make a neder? So Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, you can use that. The Chacham can use that to undo a vow. Chachamim say no. If it's so out of the ordinary that even a normal person would never have even thought of this situation happening, never expected it, you can't use that to undo a vow. It has to be something that you didn't take into consideration, but it was something that most people could have and should have taken into consideration, not something totally out of the ordinary. Okay, that's a machloket over there. So now we're going to say that the question here is that the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, this seemed to be something that was very out of the ordinary. So even if they made a vow, the Chachamim in this over here say, if they made the vow before the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, then it's a valid vow. Now, why? The destruction of Bet HaMikdash, we're assuming, was something that was very out of the ordinary, right? It was a surprise. People did not expect it to be destroyed. So, according to Chachamim, that's why they would make this distinction, and say that if they made the vow before the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, it's a valid vow. But Rabbi Eliezer should have disagreed over here in this Mishnah. And he should have said, listen, even though it was a small chance, and this was a totally new situation of the destruction of Bet HaMikdash, still, that should have been taken into consideration, and that would be sufficient to annul the vow. From the fact that Rabbi Eliezer does not disagree in this Mishnah, we see that Rabbi Eliezer must have changed his mind. And so that's why Rabbah said the rabbis overwhelmed Rabbi Eliezer, and they forced him to agree with their opinion. Okay, remember, this is the same Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkenos of the Avan Avachnai, where the sages, bring many arguments and excommunicate him. So you see, we could read this story in conjunction with that one, that Rabbi Eliezer often, here in another case, was a standalone minority opinion, and the sages ganged up and against him. In this case, they overwhelmed him, and he had to agree, and that's why his differing opinion is not recorded in our Mishnah. Okay, good. Now, another comment on this case. Amar Rava, Afal gav damur Rabbanan en potchin benolad, aval potchin betnai nolad, hechi dami, amri lehon, ilu ata inish v'amar lechon dechara bet hamikdash, mihava nadritun. Okay, Rava can support Nachum Hamadi's opinion, and says, even according to Rabbanan, who say that you cannot undo a vow based on a new unforeseen circumstance. But what you can do is you can annul a vow, find an opening in a vow with a condition that relates to an unforeseen circumstance. So you just have to add in another step. For example, they would say, if the person says, the Chacham says to the person who made the vow, if someone came to you and gave you a news report that the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, would you have made a neder? So you see, this is a condition that we're adding in. So it's more likely that someone can imagine that, we'll get a news report, a rumor that the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed. We're in the middle of a war and rumors were going around. And so this is something that would be more expected. So the fact of the Bet HaMikdash being destroyed, that would be unforeseen, unsuspected. But the possibility that someone would have reported, hey, I heard the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, that is something that can make it more expected. And so, if the Chacham tells the person, had you received such a report, would you have made a neder? And if he says, no, if I heard even such a rumor, I would have said, you know what, I better not be a neder. Even if it was not confirmed, I wouldn't have been a neder. So then that is sufficient grounds to annul it. So while you can't use a nolad directly, you can use a tanai based on a nolad. All right, and so it could be that would be Nachum Hamadi could use this as a defense and say, yeah, that's why I undid it in any case. All right, Amar Rav Yosef, Ihavai hatam, havai amin, hava amina lehon, haketib, hechal Hashem, hechal Hashem, hechal Hashem hema, ze migdash rishon, migdash sheni. So Rav Yosef says, if I was there when those Nazirim came, I would have been able to help them out and say that it's not nolad, so that this is something that could have been and should have been expected, that the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed. How does he know that? Well, Yirmiyah quotes the people saying, Hechal Hashem, this is the sanctuary of God, the sanctuary of God. They say it 3 times. Now, in the Peshat reading, the people saying it are in disbelief. They're like, yeah, you're telling us Bet HaMikdash is going to be destroyed? This is God's sanctuary, right? And they kept repeating it to say, almost like a chant, to say, impossible, right? Hashem dwells here. It's never going to be destroyed, right? No matter what happens, it will never be destroyed. Okay, but Rav Yosef is reading it in the opposite way, to say that it's going to be destroyed. The 3-time repetition, the first one refers to the destruction of the first Bet HaMikdash, and the second one's referring to the second Bet HaMikdash. Each of the echal is referring to another Bet HaMikdash. Here's the first one, here's the second one. From the fact that we had a third phrase, Hechal Hashem, means there's going to be a third Bet HaMikdash. Why would there need to be a third Bet HaMikdash? Because the first and second, the first was already destroyed, the second is going to be destroyed. So you see, based on this pasuk, they knew that the Bet HaMikdash would be destroyed, and so they didn't know exactly when, but they did expect it would be destroyed, and therefore this is not nolad, right? If you were living here at the time, you could have seen you could have listened to Yirmiyahu who said it's going to be destroyed. You could have read the op-eds in the news saying, listen, so people were saying they think it's going to be destroyed. This pasuk says it's going to be destroyed. Yirmiyahu said it explicitly, in fact. So therefore, it's not a nolad, and that's why that if I was there, I would have helped them out. I wouldn't have to rely on nolad or to be Eliezer or anything, and I would have annulled their vows. Okay, and now we challenge this. Fine, they knew it was going to be destroyed eventually, but they didn't know when. It didn't have to be that day. It could have been another 100 years or another 1,000 years. And eventually at the end of time there'll be a third Bet Hamikdash. But so they no reason for them to expect it would happen so soon. And so they had faith that things they would be able to pull through. Amad Abaye v'layadin le'emat. Abaye says, no, what do you mean they didn't know when? They did know exactly when. V'haketib shavuim shivim nechtach alamecha ve'al ir kodshecha. Pasuk from Daniel chapter 9, when Daniel's trying to make a calculation of when is Yirmiyah's 70 years going to be up, and he says 70 doesn't mean literally 70 years, but rather 70 sets of 7 years, 70 shemitot. Which is 490 years. Now, what is this 490 years? The Peshat of the Pisukim in Daniel seems that says is referring to from the Babylonian time until the Chashmonaim, when they have political independence, and that's the fulfillment of the 70 years and redemption and all that. However, Seder Olam Rabbah, the Midrash from the times of the Tanaim, and here Abaye is assuming that 490 years is counting from the destruction of the first Bet Hamikdash until the destruction of the second Bet Hamikdash. This doesn't work out according to historical dates. But if we assume these dates of total 490 years, and the exile period was 70 years, so then we know that according to that, the second Bet Hamikdash was up for 420 years. And so they knew when it was built, and they could therefore calculate when it would be destroyed. So actually they did know at least the year when it would be destroyed. And based on that, this is something that could have been known. So this is now going to back up Rav Yosef, right? If he was there, they would have known that it's going to be destroyed, and they would have known even the year that it was going to be destroyed. And so it was that year. And so these Nazirim, you can say, listen, didn't you know it was going to be destroyed in this year? So this is not a nolad, a far-off circumstance. This is something that could be foreseen and that could be annulled. Okay. Now, nevertheless, they didn't know on which day. And so, you don't know if it's going to be now or in a few months from now. And let's say their Nazirut is just for 30 days. So they could have very well assumed that, listen, Bet HaMikdash, maybe I assume it's going to be later on. We're in the beginning of the year, so we'll still be okay. So maybe that's why they made the Nazirut, assuming that the Bet HaMikdash would still be up. And there was an unforeseen circumstance, and that it would have been destroyed so soon, and so it could be that that's the reason why the Chachamim said, no, sorry, if the Bet HaMikdash was up when you made the neder, then it's going to be difficult to undo it. All right, really fascinating story about these Nazirim and not getting the message Bet HaMikdash would be destroyed, and here trying to retroject and imagine what did people know. What did people expect? Which is a really important question. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.